Abigail, does the rise of the gig economy offer new opportunities for women in developing countries, or is this just precarious work in a different guise?
Well, I think when it comes to looking at women in developing countries, we have to remember that they have, in many cases, already been working in very precarious situations, and the gig economy doesn't necessarily offer a change to that. What it does is offer perhaps new ways to access economic opportunities, for example through mobile technology, and for example through not having necessarily to need networks in place to access work, as is often the case. However, as has been well documented in many countries in the case of Uber, the gig economy often challenges workers' rights to establish, workers' ability to access established labour rights and protections, and that's certainly no less the case with the gig economy in developing countries.
And in terms of workers organising, what challenges do these new models of work pose to traditional unions?
Yeah. I mean, there's a great number of challenges to traditional unions about the nature of the employer-employee relationship. I mean, the thing about the gig economy is that many of the workers are in what's known as an independent contractor status, according to the platforms themselves, which means that the employer-employee relationship is rendered as a commercial exchange between them as a service provider with a service purchaser. And this has a number of implications for traditional union models. The removal of a employment site is often a challenge for traditional union models that are based on such an arrangement. And many traditional unions have been quite slow to respond to that new reality that workers are finding themselves in. The nature of the commercial relationship is also a great challenge. Because in some cases, for example, where workers come together and, for example, may want to make a case around the hourly rate, for example, of the service that they're providing, in some cases this can be seen as violation of antitrust laws because they're seen as commercial entities. Which means that if they come together to talk about hourly rates, that could be seen as a form of commercial price fixing or development of a cartel. So it's these kind of challenges that unions really, if they want to talk about the reality of gig economy workers, need to really start thinking about how to adapt and how to support those workers, which we're not necessarily seeing. On the other hand, what we are seeing is new forms of organising, particularly grassroots organising amongst independent workers who are coming together, and where we've seen successful litigation, for example around against Uber or Deliveroo, it's often been workers that have come together in grassroots forms of organisation who've been supported by the more formal unions. So perhaps collaborations of these kind also offer promise. And I think lastly I would just say to more so-called traditional unions looking to think about how to support gig economy workers, a lot of lessons could be learnt from self-employed workers associations such as SEWA in India, which is a, as it says on the tin, really self-employed workers association of women who are largely informal and has had very many decades of experience bringing workers together who are experiencing many of the same issues in dispersed workplaces and working independently. So I think a lot of lessons could also be learned from very well established organisations such as these.
Peter, does the rise of the gig economy offer flexible working opportunities, or is this part of a continued move back to more crude forms of worker exploitation?
Well, I think the answer to that is affirmative in both senses. It does offer more flexibility for individuals to engage in forms of self-exploitation. Yeah, plainly, the organisations behind these platforms that are generating gig employment are keen to not have responsibility for the direct employment relationship, which was the dominant form of paid working in the 20th century. These people, Uber drivers, Deliveroo drivers, are allegedly self-employed, but this is a bogus form of self-employment, as the recent legal test cases have proven. They are, in fact, dependent on the platforms for the supply of work, and ultimately they are in a wage labour relationship. They take payment from customers, but return a large portion of that payment to the platform company. What we're seeing with many of these new forms of working is actually a return to much cruder forms of business organisation. A form of business organisation that relies on the generation of profits by extending the working day through wage theft, by penalising workers for a failure to attend the workplace. If one thinks of big organisations like Amazon, for example, Amazon employs thousands of workers around the globe. Most of them are unorganised by trade unions and are subject to increasingly oppressive forms of surveillance at work. What we find with Amazon is that new technology is present in the workplace, but it's being used as a mechanism of control. So workers wear wrist tags so that their activities can be monitored by the second. They will be allotted a certain period of time to pick the goods that are eventually packed and supplied to customers. Everything depends on ensuring maximum effort while individuals are in the workplace, and that can take the form of employees, in the case of Amazon, having to queue to leave the warehouse at the end of the working day, but that is unpaid work. So we find this reversal back to sort of forms, business models that depend on generating profits by extending the working day, removing breaks, minimising time off the job, so that the relationship between wages and the work performed in any given day is very much in favour of profit generation.
And what does this mean in terms of worker organisation and challenges to traditional forms of unions?
Yeah, well, there are a number of points to make here. First of all, trade unions are having a bad time in many sectors of the economy because of the fragmentation of workplaces. Traditionally, unions were strongest in large workplaces, in what are sometimes referred to as centralised workstations, where a large number of workers are brought together under one roof, so to speak. That is increasingly rare in the contemporary capitalist economy. Workplaces tend to be much more fragmented, and that makes the job of organising workers more difficult. On the other hand, if you think of companies like Amazon or Sports Direct, these large warehouses that supply goods to customers do bring together large numbers of workers in one place, and is potentially very fertile ground for unions to organise. However, we tend to find that these bigger workplaces are often run by organisations that have a very strong anti-trade union ethos, and that is the case with Amazon in the UK. In Germany, Amazon has been forced by the regulatory framework to recognise trade unions, and we have some evidence that the conditions of workers in the German Amazon warehouses are far better than here. So there's a real challenge. The unions have to develop ways of organising workers without necessarily striking a bargain with employers up front. This is going to require unions to become technologically savvy and to find ways of organising workers in fragmented and centralised workstations using distributed technologies.